The winter of 1887 brought death to the Montana Territory. While most men fled south when the wolves came down from the glacier peaks, one cowboy named Fletcher Barnes made a choice that would echo through Blackfoot campfires for generations. Armed with nothing but a Winchester rifle and a promise he'd made to a dying rancher, Barnes faced down the largest wolf pack anyone had ever seen. What happened next in that frozen valley would prove that some men are willing to pay any price to keep their word. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins 3 months before the wolves descended in the dusty town of Millbrook, Montana. Fletcher Barnes had been drifting through cattle country for the better part of 5 years, picking up work wherever his reputation hadn't preceded him. At 32, he carried the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much frontier justice and dealt out his fair share. His hands bore the permanent stains of leather reins and gunpowder, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of wariness that came from sleeping with one ear open. It was September when Barnes rode into the Rocking H Ranch. Looking for work before the harsh Montana winter set in, the ranch belonged to Thomas Henley, a former Union cavalry officer who'd claimed this stretch of land near the Blackfoot Reservation boundary after the war. Henley was a fair man, respected by his cowboys and tolerated by the Blackfoot who occasionally crossed his land to reach their traditional hunting grounds. The arrangement had worked peacefully for over a decade. Barnes had heard about Henley's reputation in town, a rancher who paid his men on time and didn't ask too many questions about their past. More importantly, Henley was known for keeping his word, a quality that had become increasingly rare as the frontier filled with opportunists and carpetbaggers. When Barnes rode up to the ranch house that crisp autumn morning, he found Henley mending fence posts with his own hands. Working alongside his hired men rather than barking orders from the porch, the rancher looked up as Barnes approached, taking in the stranger's travel-worn clothes and the careful way he kept his right hand near his Colt. Henley had an eye for reading men, developed through years of command during the war and refined by 2 decades of frontier life. What he saw in Barnes wasn't the reckless swagger of a troublemaker, but the controlled tension of someone who'd learned to be ready for anything. After a brief conversation that revealed more through what wasn't said than what was, Henley offered Barnes work as a line rider, patrolling the ranch's vast boundaries and keeping an eye on the cattle scattered across the northern pastures. The pay was fair, the work honest, and most importantly for Barnes, it would keep him away from town and the kinds of complications that had driven him from place to place. The Rocking H employed 12 cowboys during the busy season, a mix of young drifters looking to prove themselves and older hands who'd found a home worth staying for. Among them was Samuel Webb, a weathered veteran who'd worked for Henley since the ranch's early days. Webb had lost his left arm to a Crow war party in '79, but had adapted his riding and roping skills with the determination of a man who refused to be broken by misfortune. There was also Miguel Santos, whose family had originally held a land grant in this territory before American expansion changed everything. Santos possessed an almost mystical understanding of cattle behavior and could predict weather changes days in advance. Despite the prejudice he faced in town, Henley valued his expertise and treated him with the respect his skills deserved. The youngest member of the crew was Bobby Hutchinson, barely 18 and eager to prove he belonged among the hardened cowboys. Hutchinson had grown up on a failing farm in Kansas and saw cowboy work as his chance to escape a life of poverty and disappointment. His enthusiasm sometimes outweighed his judgment, but the older hands looked out for him with the protective instinct that bound these men together. Barnes settled into the rhythm of ranch life with the ease of someone who'd found similar work before. His days began before dawn, checking the cattle in the northern pastures where the glacier peaks loomed like silent sentinels. The work was solitary, which suited him fine. and the vastness of the Montana landscape provided the kind of space where a man could think without interruption. It was during these long rides that Barnes first encountered the Blackfoot hunting parties crossing Henley's land. The meetings were initially tense, with both sides sizing each other up while maintaining the careful neutrality that had kept the peace. The Blackfoot warriors, led by a respected elder named Running Bear, were following ancient trails to reach elk herds in the high country before winter arrived. Running Bear was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His English was careful but precise, learned through decades of dealing with white settlers and government officials. During their first encounter, he and Barnes regarded each other with the mutual recognition of men who understood violence but preferred to avoid it when possible. Over the following weeks, these chance meetings developed into something approaching friendship. Running Bear shared knowledge about the changing weather patterns and animal movements, while Barnes offered information about cattle locations that might interfere with the hunting routes. Both men understood they were maintaining a delicate balance that benefited everyone involved. It was Running Bear who first mentioned the wolves. During a cold October morning, when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds, the Blackfoot elder paused during one of their conversations to study the distant mountains. His expression grew troubled as he pointed toward the high peaks where early snow had already begun to accumulate. The wolves, Running Bear explained, were not behaving as they should. For generations, the packs had followed predictable patterns, moving to lower elevations as winter approached, but maintaining their territorial boundaries. This year something was different. Scouts from his tribe had reported signs of multiple packs moving together, their traditional territories abandoned in favor of a massive congregation near the headwaters of Willow Creek. Barnes listened with growing concern as Running Bear described tracks in the snow that suggested pack sizes far beyond anything previously recorded. The Blackfoot had coexisted with wolves for countless generations, understanding their behavior and respecting their place in the natural order. When Running Bear spoke of his unease about what he'd observed, Barnes knew the situation was serious. The confirmation came 2 weeks later when Santos returned from checking the northern line with disturbing news. He'd found the remains of 3 steers, killed and partially consumed in a manner that spoke of wolf predation. But the scale of the attack was unprecedented. The cattle had been brought down by what Santos estimated to be at least 20 wolves working together. Henley received this news with the grim acceptance of a man who'd faced crisis before. Wolf predation was an expected cost of ranching in Montana territory, but losses of this magnitude threatened the ranch's survival. The northern pastures contained nearly half of his herd, cattle that needed to remain on the range until the spring roundup. Moving them would mean overcrowding the southern pastures and risking disease and starvation. As October turned to November, the attacks intensified. Webb reported finding the tracks of what appeared to be an enormous pack moving through the foothills, following the cattle herds with the patience of experienced predators. The wolves seemed to be testing the ranch's defenses, probing for weaknesses while avoiding direct confrontation with the armed cowboys. Barnes found himself spending more time in the northern pastures, riding patterns that would keep him close to the most vulnerable cattle. His encounters with Running Bear became more frequent as the Blackfoot elders' own concerns about the wolf situation grew. The tribe's hunters were reporting similar unusual behavior throughout their traditional territory, with normal game patterns disrupted by the presence of the massive pack. During one of these meetings, Running Bear shared a disturbing piece of information. His scouts had discovered the remains of a small Blackfoot hunting party that had been attacked while camping near the headwaters. The evidence suggested they had fought bravely, but the overwhelming numbers of wolves had made resistance futile. This was unprecedented in tribal memory. Wolves might scavenge human remains, but they had never been known to actively hunt people. The news sent a chill through both the ranch and the Blackfoot camp. If the wolves were desperate enough to attack humans, it meant their normal food sources had been exhausted or driven away. The massive pack was no longer just a threat to livestock. It had become a danger to anyone traveling through the Northern Territory. Henley called a meeting of all his men to discuss the situation. The ranch house parlor, usually reserved for business meetings with cattle buyers, filled with the scent of leather and tobacco as the cowboys gathered around the oak table. Outside, the November wind carried the first hints of the brutal winter that was approaching. The rancher laid out the situation with military precision. The northern pastures contained approximately 400 head of cattle, representing the majority of the ranch's assets. Moving them south was possible, but would require weeks of dangerous work in increasingly harsh weather. Leaving them in place meant accepting heavy losses to wolf predation, losses that might bankrupt the ranch. Santos suggested building large fires around the perimeter of the northern pastures, using the wolves' natural fear of flame to keep them at bay. But this would require constant vigilance from the entire crew, and fuel for such fires would be difficult to maintain through a Montana winter. Webb proposed organizing hunting parties to track and eliminate the pack leaders, disrupting the wolves' coordination. However, the size of the pack made this approach extremely dangerous. Young Hutchinson, with the fearless enthusiasm of youth, volunteered to ride to Fort Benton and request military assistance. But Henley knew the army had its hands full with ongoing tensions on other reservations, and was unlikely to spare troops for what they would see as a civilian problem. As the discussion continued, Burns found his thoughts turning to the promise he'd made to himself when he took this job. For the first time in years, he'd found a place where he was valued for his skills rather than feared for his reputation. Henley had given him honest work and fair treatment, asking no questions about the past that had driven him from place to place. The other cowboys had accepted him as one of their own, sharing the bonds of mutual reliance that made their dangerous work possible. More than that, Barnes had begun to feel something he'd almost forgotten, a sense of belonging. The vast Montana landscape had worked its magic on him, offering the kind of peace that comes from honest labor under an endless sky. For the first time since the war, he'd found a reason to stay in one place, to build something rather than simply survive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but Barnes knew what he had to do. That night, as the other cowboys settled into their bunks in the bunkhouse, he sat by the window looking out at the northern mountains. The peaks were lost in darkness, but he could feel their presence like a weight against the horizon. Somewhere up there, the wolf pack was waiting, growing bolder with each passing day. Barnes understood that the situation would only worsen as winter tightened its grip on the territory. Desperate wolves would become increasingly aggressive, and the attacks would escalate until the entire northern range became uninhabitable. The ranch's survival depended on someone taking decisive action before the pack grew bold enough to strike at the heart of the operation. The next morning brought the first significant snowfall of the season, a heavy blanket of white that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and ominous. Barnes watched from the bunkhouse window as the snow continued to fall, knowing that each flake brought the wolves closer to their final descent from the mountains. When Santos returned from the morning patrol with news that fresh tracks had been found less than 2 miles from the main ranch buildings, Barnes made his decision. That evening, he approached Henley with a proposal that would test every principle the rancher held dear. Barnes offered to take a position in the northern line camp, a small cabin that served as a base for cowboys working the most distant pastures. From there, he could maintain constant surveillance of the cattle and provide early warning of any major wolf movements. It was dangerous work under the best of circumstances, and with the current threat, it amounted to a suicide mission. Henley's initial reaction was immediate refusal. He wouldn't ask any man to face such odds alone, regardless of the potential benefits to the ranch. But Barnes persisted, explaining that his experience and skills made him uniquely qualified for this type of work. He'd faced similar situations before, he claimed, though he didn't elaborate on the circumstances. The conversation stretched late into the night, with Barnes gradually wearing down Henley's resistance through logic and determination. The northern cattle represented the ranch's future, and someone needed to protect them until spring made it possible to move the herd to safety. If Barnes was willing to take the risk, Henley reluctantly agreed to let him try. The decision was made to establish the northern watch post the following week, giving Barnes time to prepare and gather the supplies he would need. Word of his volunteer mission spread through the bunkhouse, generating a mixture of admiration and concern among his fellow cowboys. They understood the courage required for such an undertaking, but they also recognized the slim odds of survival. As Barnes prepared for his solitary vigil, he found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this point. The violence and mistakes of his past had driven him across half the continent, always moving, never settling, never allowing himself to form the connections that made life meaningful. Now, for the first time in years, he'd found something worth protecting, people who depended on him, and a place that felt like home. The irony wasn't lost on him that his chance at redemption would likely cost him everything he'd finally found worth living for. But Fletcher Barnes had learned long ago that a man's character was defined by the choices he made when everything was on the line. As he cleaned his weapons and packed his supplies, he knew he was preparing for more than just a battle with wolves. He was preparing for the fight that would define the rest of his life. However long that might be, the northern line camp sat in a valley carved by glacial ice thousands of years earlier, surrounded by towering pines that creaked and swayed in the constant wind. The cabin itself was a sturdy structure built from local timber, with walls thick enough to stop rifle bullets and a stone chimney that drew cleanly in any weather. Previous occupants had carved their initials into the doorframe, a record of the solitary men who'd guarded this remote outpost over the years. Barnes arrived at the camp on a grey December morning when the temperature hadn't climbed above zero for 3 days. His pack horse carried enough supplies to last through the winter: ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, and extra blankets. More importantly, he'd brought his father's Winchester rifle, a weapon that had served him faithfully through years of frontier conflicts. The first week passed quietly, with Barnes establishing the routines that would keep him alive through the long winter months. Each dawn found him checking the cattle scattered across the valley floor, counting heads and looking for signs of overnight predation. The animals seemed nervous, bunching together in tight groups rather than spreading out to graze as they normally would. On the 8th day, Barnes found his first kill. A young bull had been brought down near Willow Creek, torn apart with the methodical efficiency that marked wolf predation. But the size of the bite marks and the width of the paw prints in the snow told a story that chilled him more than the December wind. These weren't ordinary wolves. The tracks led upstream toward the high country, and Barnes followed them for several miles before the trail disappeared into rocky terrain where snow couldn't hold prints. Along the way, he discovered something that made his blood run cold: human footprints alongside the wolf tracks, as if someone had been walking with the pack. That night, Barnes sat by his fire cleaning weapons and trying to make sense of what he'd seen. His experience in various frontier conflicts had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something unnatural was happening in these mountains. Wolves didn't grow to the size suggested by those tracks, and they certainly didn't accept human companions. The answer came 3 days later, when Running Bear arrived at the camp, appearing out of the swirling snow like a ghost. The Blackfoot elder's face bore the grim expression of a man carrying terrible news. He'd ridden through dangerous countries to reach Barnes, driven by information too important to wait for their usual chance meetings. Running Bear's story unfolded slowly, in the careful English he reserved for matters of great importance. 2 months earlier, a Blackfoot hunting party had encountered a white man living alone in a cave near the headwaters. The man spoke broken Blackfoot and claimed to be a trapper, but his behavior was strange, erratic. He seemed to communicate with the wolves, calling them with sounds that weren't quite human. The hunters had reported this to the tribal council, but the elders had dismissed it as the ravings of men who'd spent too long in the wilderness. Mountain men were known for their eccentric behavior, and the Blackfoot had learned to avoid rather than confront white trappers who'd chosen isolation over civilization. But as the wolf attacks intensified, Running Bear had begun to suspect a connection. He'd returned to the headwaters with a small scouting party, tracking the mysterious trapper to his lair. What they'd found defied everything the Blackfoot knew about the natural world. The cave was surrounded by wolf signs, but these weren't normal territorial markings. Bones had been arranged in patterns that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The wolves showed no fear of the human occupant, treating him as a member of their pack hierarchy. Most disturbing of all, the man seemed to share their hunger for fresh meat, raw and bloody. Running Bear's warriors had watched from concealment as the trapper emerged at dusk, moving on all fours, like the wolves around him. His clothes were in tatters, his hair grown long and matted. When he raised his head to howl at the darkening sky, the sound that emerged was neither fully human nor fully wolf. But something caught between both worlds. The scouting party had retreated without confronting this abomination, but they'd seen enough to understand the true nature of the threat facing the territory. This wasn't simply an unusually large wolf pack. It was a pack led by something that had once been human, but had chosen to embrace its most savage instincts. Barnes listened to this account with growing horror, but also with recognition. He'd heard similar stories during his time in Colorado. Tales of men who'd spent so long alone in the wilderness that they'd forgotten what it meant to be civilized. The frontier attracted such individuals, men running from society or from themselves, seeking isolation in places where normal rules didn't apply. But this situation had escalated beyond simple madness. The trapper had somehow assumed leadership of the wolf pack, directing their attacks with human intelligence while retaining their savage nature. The combination made him far more dangerous than either man or beast alone. Running Bear concluded his story with a warning. The pack was preparing for a major assault, gathering strength for an attack that would establish their dominance over the entire region. Blackfoot scouts had observed wolves moving through the passes in unprecedented numbers, all converging on the territory around the rocking H Ranch after the elder departed, melting back into the snow-covered landscape with the silent skill of his people. Barnes found himself alone, with knowledge that changed everything. He was no longer simply protecting cattle from natural predators. He was standing against something far more sinister and dangerous. The first major attack came 5 days later, just before dawn, on the winter solstice. Barnes was awakened by the sound of cattle in distress, a chorus of bellowing that echoed off the valley walls. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the cabin's covered porch, peering through the pre-dawn darkness toward the source of the commotion. What he saw defied his years of frontier experience. The cattle were running in blind panic, pursued by shapes that moved with coordinated precision through the darkness. But these weren't the chaotic movements of a wolf pack following hunting instincts. They were the calculated maneuvers of a military unit executing a planned assault. Barnes opened fire, his Winchester cracking repeatedly in the cold air. He saw wolves fall, but others immediately took their places, maintaining the pressure on the terrified cattle. The pack's discipline was unnatural, their persistence beyond anything he'd encountered in decades of wilderness living. The battle lasted until full daylight, with Barnes firing from multiple positions around the cabin to give the impression of greater numbers. His marksmanship took a toll on the attacking wolves, but he could see that the pack's size made his efforts ultimately futile. For every wolf he dropped, two more seemed to emerge from the timber. When the wolves finally withdrew, Barnes surveyed the carnage with a heavy heart. 17 cattle lay dead or dying in the snow, their blood staining the white ground in expanding crimson pools. The financial loss to the ranch was devastating, but the tactical implications were even worse. The pack had tested his defenses and found them inadequate. Over the following weeks, the attacks continued with increasing boldness. The wolves seemed to understand that Barnes was alone, gradually tightening their circle around the isolated cabin. They began killing cattle within sight of his position, as if taunting him with his inability to protect the herd. Barnes adapted his tactics, setting fires around the most vulnerable areas and using the howling wind to mask his movements between defensive positions. But he was fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds, and both sides knew it. The wolf pack grew bolder with each successful attack, their confidence building toward an inevitable final assault. The psychological pressure was perhaps worse than the physical danger. The constant vigilance required to survive began wearing on Barnes's nerves, and the isolation magnified every sound in the darkness beyond his fire's glow. The wolves seemed to understand this, often approaching close enough for their eyes to reflect the firelight before melting back into the shadows. During the long nights, Barnes found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this desperate situation. He could have ridden south when the first attacks began, saving himself and leaving others to face the consequences. The old Barnes, the drifter who'd spent years running from responsibility, might have made that choice without hesitation, but something fundamental had changed in him during his months at the Rocking H. He'd discovered what it meant to be part of something larger than his own survival, to have people who depended on him and valued his contributions. The thought of abandoning that trust was more terrifying than facing any number of wolves. Christmas passed without celebration, marked only by a particularly vicious attack that cost Barnes his remaining ammunition reserves. He'd managed to drive off the wolves, but at the cost of nearly exhausting his ability to fight. The pack seemed to sense his weakening position, growing bolder in their approaches to the cabin. It was then that Barnes made a discovery that changed his understanding of the entire situation. While checking his trap lines near the creek, he found evidence that the wolves weren't simply hunting for food. They were systematically destroying every source of sustenance in the valley. Game trails that had been active for decades were empty, driven away by the constant presence of the enlarged pack. The implications were staggering. The pack wasn't just threatening the cattle, they were claiming the entire territory as their hunting ground, eliminating all competition for resources. This wasn't predation. It was conquest, guided by an intelligence that no natural wolf pack possessed. That evening, as Barnes sat cleaning his rifle by firelight, he heard something that made his blood freeze. From the darkness beyond the cabin came a sound that was almost human speech, but distorted by vocal cords that had forgotten how to form words properly. The trapper was calling to him, offering terms for surrender. The voice spoke of joining the pack, of abandoning the pretense of civilization and embracing the freedom of savage existence. It described the ecstasy of the hunt, the pure joy of living without moral constraints or social obligations. The words were seductive, offering escape from the impossible situation Barnes faced. But as he listened to that inhuman voice describing the pleasures of abandoning humanity, Barnes felt something harden in his chest. He thought of Henley's trust, of Santos's quiet dignity, of young Hutchinson's eager dreams. He remembered Running Bear's courage in bringing warning, and the responsibility that came with knowledge of the truth. When Barnes finally responded to the creature in the darkness, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd found his purpose. He rejected the offer with words that cut through the winter air like blade strokes, declaring his intention to stand against everything the pack represented. The laughter that emerged from the shadows in response was more terrifying than any wolf howl Barnes had ever heard. It spoke of madness embraced and humanity discarded, of choices that could never be undone. When it finally faded, replaced by the usual sounds of wind and forest, Barnes knew that the final confrontation was approaching. The next morning brought news that both encouraged and terrified him. Smoke signals from the direction of the Blackfoot camp indicated that Running Bear was mobilizing his warriors for battle. The tribal council had finally accepted the truth about the threat they faced and was preparing to act. But Barnes also knew that help, if it came at all, would arrive too late to save the remaining cattle or prevent the pack from establishing permanent dominance over the region. The responsibility for stopping this nightmare still rested on his shoulders. Alone in a cabin surrounded by increasingly aggressive predators, as he prepared for what might be his final night, Barnes wrote a letter to Henley, explaining the true nature of the threat and his own intentions. He sealed it carefully and placed it where it would be found by whoever eventually came to investigate his fate. The words on that paper represented his testament, the final accounting of a man who'd found redemption in sacrifice. Outside, the wolves were gathering for their ultimate assault, their howls creating a symphony of savage anticipation that echoed off the valley walls. Barnes checked his remaining ammunition one final time and settled in to wait for whatever dawn might bring. The final assault began at 3 in the morning, when the temperature had dropped to 30 below zero and the world lay silent under a blanket of fresh snow. Barnes had dozed fitfully in his chair by the window, rifle across his knees, when the first howl shattered the winter stillness. But this wasn't the typical hunting call he'd grown accustomed to. This was something far more organized and deliberate. The howls came from every direction, simultaneously, a coordinated signal that spoke of military precision. Barnes grabbed his field glasses and peered through the frost-covered window, scanning the moonlit landscape for movement. What he saw made his heart race with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Wolves were emerging from the tree line in formation, moving with the disciplined advance of seasoned soldiers. At least 60 animals spread across the valley floor, their pale fur almost invisible against the snow, except for the steam of their breath in the frigid air. Leading them was a figure that moved upright on 2 legs, but with the fluid grace of something that had forgotten the constraints of human posture. The creature that had once been a man stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body elongated and twisted by months of savage living. Matted hair covered most of its form, and its fingers had grown into claw-like appendages capable of tearing flesh with ease. Most disturbing were its eyes, which held a flickering intelligence that spoke of calculated malice rather than simple animal hunger. Barnes understood immediately that this wasn't just an attack, it was an execution planned, with human cunning and wolf ruthlessness. The pack had surrounded the cabin completely, cutting off any possibility of escape or tactical retreat. They intended to end his resistance once and for all, establishing their dominance through overwhelming force. The first wave struck the cabin's defenses with shocking violence. Wolves hurled themselves against the reinforced door and shuttered windows, while others scrambled onto the roof, trying to tear through the thick wooden shingles. Barnes moved from position to position, firing through loopholes he'd cut in the walls weeks earlier, trying to thin their numbers before they could breach his defenses. His marksmanship was deadly accurate, each shot dropping a wolf in its tracks. But for every animal that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, pressing the attack with supernatural persistence. The Winchester's barrel grew hot in his hands as he worked the lever action and spent cartridges piling up around his boots. Through the chaos of battle, Barnes caught glimpses of the pack leader directing the assault with gestures and inhuman vocalizations. The creature moved among its followers like a general commanding troops, repositioning wolves to exploit weaknesses in the cabin's defenses and coordinating attacks from multiple angles simultaneously. The roof began to give way under the combined weight of a dozen wolves, wooden beams creaking ominously as claws scraped against the interior planking. Barnes fired upward through the ceiling, his bullets finding targets, but failing to stop the systematic destruction of his shelter. Chunks of wood and snow began falling into the cabin as gaps opened overhead. Realizing that the building would soon become a trap rather than a fortress, Barnes made the decision that would define his legend. He gathered his remaining ammunition, strapped on his gun belt, and prepared to take the fight outside. The creature in the darkness had offered him the choice between surrender and destruction. Barnes was about to show that a third option existed. He kicked open the cabin door and stepped onto the covered porch, Winchester in hand and Colt revolver holstered at his side. The wolves immediately converged on his position, a flood of white fur and snapping teeth rushing through the snow. Barnes worked the rifle with mechanical precision, dropping the closest attackers while backing toward the frozen creek, where the terrain would force them to approach from limited directions. The battle moved across the valley floor in a running firefight that tested every skill Barnes had acquired. During his years on the frontier, he used every tree, boulder, and depression for cover, making the wolves pay dearly for each yard they gained. His ammunition dwindled rapidly, but his accuracy never wavered. Each shot placed with the deadly precision of a man fighting for more than just his own life. The pack leader shadowed the battle from a distance, its inhuman voice directing the assault with strategic intelligence that no ordinary predator possessed. It seemed to understand Barnes's tactics, countering each defensive maneuver with coordinated responses that gradually wore down his ammunition reserves and physical stamina. When the Winchester's magazine finally emptied, Barnes drew his Colt and continued fighting, the revolver's heavier bullets dropping wolves at close range. But he was being driven steadily backward toward the valley's narrow mouth, where the terrain would allow the pack to surround him completely. Time was running out, and both sides knew it. It was then that the unexpected happened. War cries echoed from the ridgeline above, followed by the thunder of horses descending the steep slopes at breakneck speed. Running Bear and 24 Blackfoot warriors had arrived, their horses specially shod with steel cleats for winter fighting, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. The wolves' formation wavered as arrows began falling among them with devastating accuracy. The Blackfoot warriors rode through the pack like mounted death, their horses trained for close combat, their lances and war clubs taking a terrible toll. The coordinated assault that had nearly overwhelmed Barnes suddenly found itself fighting on two fronts, but the pack leader proved as adaptable as it was savage. With a howl that contained both wolf fury and human rage, it split its forces, sending half to engage the mounted warriors while maintaining pressure on Barnes's position. The creature understood that eliminating the lone cowboy remained its primary objective. The warriors could be dealt with once Barnes was dead. The battle intensified as three separate engagements raged simultaneously across the valley floor. Barnes fought his way toward the Blackfoot warriors, his revolver empty, but his knife still sharp. Running Bear and his men carved through wolf ranks with the skill of born fighters, their horses wheeling and charging in patterns perfected by generations of mounted warfare. The pack leader finally abandoned its strategic position and entered the battle personally, its inhuman form moving with terrifying speed across the snow-covered ground. It targeted Barnes specifically, recognizing him as the symbol of resistance that had to be destroyed. The two closed on each other in a confrontation that represented far more than simple combat. Barnes met the creature's charge with his knife drawn, the blade flashing in the moonlight as he fought hand-to-hand against an opponent that possessed both human intelligence and superhuman strength. The battle was brutal and personal, two figures locked in mortal combat while chaos raged around them. The creature's claws raked across Barnes's chest, tearing through his heavy coat and drawing blood that steamed in the frigid air. But Barnes had fought men and beasts before, and he understood that victory often went to whoever was willing to sacrifice more. His knife found its mark repeatedly, opening wounds that would have dropped any normal opponent. Running Bear's warriors began turning the tide against the remaining wolves, their superior mobility and weapons proving decisive in the open terrain. But the battle's outcome still hinged on the personal duel between Barnes and the pack leader, a confrontation that had become symbolic of the larger struggle between civilization and savagery. The creature's strength was beginning to tell, its superhuman endurance gradually overwhelming Barnes's skill and determination. But as it prepared to deliver the killing blow, Barnes made one final desperate gambit. He allowed the creature to close within striking distance, then drove his knife upward with all his remaining strength, the blade penetrating between ribs to find the heart that still beat within the monster's chest. The pack leader's death cry was a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, a mixture of human agony and animal fury that echoed off the valley walls before fading into silence. The creature collapsed onto the blood-stained snow, its body reverting slightly toward human form as death released its grip on the savage transformation. With their leader dead, the surviving wolves lost their coordination and discipline. They scattered into the darkness, fleeing toward the high country with the demoralized retreat of broken forces. The Blackfoot warriors pursued them for several miles, ensuring that none remained to threaten the territory again. Barnes collapsed beside his fallen opponent, his strength finally exhausted by the prolonged battle. Running Bear dismounted and knelt beside him, checking wounds that were serious but not immediately fatal. The cowboy had paid a heavy price for his victory, but he had achieved something that would be remembered as long as stories were told around campfires. As dawn broke over the valley, revealing the full extent of the carnage, Running Bear's warriors began the grim task of counting the dead. Nearly 40 wolves lay scattered across the battlefield, along with the twisted form of the creature that had led them. The snow was stained red in a dozen places, marking sites where desperate struggles had played out in the darkness. The Blackfoot elder helped Barnes back to the damaged cabin, where they found the letter he'd written to Henley the night before. Running Bear read the words carefully, understanding their significance not just to the rancher but to the broader story of what had transpired. This was more than a record of events. It was a testament to the kind of courage that defined legends. Over the following days, as Barnes recovered from his wounds, the full magnitude of his accomplishment became clear. Word of the battle spread throughout the territory, carried by Blackfoot messengers and traveling cowboys who witnessed the aftermath. The story grew with each telling, but the essential truth remained unchanged. One man had chosen to stand against impossible odds rather than abandon his responsibilities. Henley arrived at the cabin 3 days later with a search party, expecting to find disaster, but hoping for survival. What he discovered was a scene that would be preserved in territorial memory for generations. His trusted employee had not only survived the wolf crisis, but had eliminated the threat entirely, saving both the ranch and the broader community. The rancher surveyed the battlefield with the eye of a former cavalry officer, recognizing the tactical complexity of what had occurred. This hadn't been simple predator control. It had been a military engagement fought against an enemy that combined animal ferocity with human intelligence. That Barnes had emerged victorious spoke to qualities that transcended ordinary heroism. Running Bear remained at the cabin until Barnes was strong enough to travel, the two men developing a friendship that would endure for the rest of their lives. The Blackfoot elder understood that he had witnessed something remarkable, not just the defeat of a supernatural threat, but the transformation of a man who had found his true purpose in serving others. When they finally prepared to leave the valley, Barnes took one last look at the cabin that had been his fortress during the desperate weeks of winter. The building bore scars from the final battle, but it had served its purpose, providing the base from which he had protected everything he'd come to value. The structure would stand for decades, a monument to the choices men make when everything they hold dear is threatened. The journey back to the ranch headquarters was a triumphal procession, with Blackfoot warriors and cowboys riding together in mutual respect. They had shared danger and victory, forging bonds that would influence relations between their peoples for years to come. Barnes rode among them, not as the drifter who had arrived months earlier, but as a man who had proven himself worthy of the legends that would grow from his deeds. The spring of 1888 brought changes to the Montana Territory that would be felt for generations. As the snow melted from the high peaks and green grass began to emerge in the valleys, stories of Fletcher Barnes's winter battle spread beyond the immediate region, carried by traveling merchants, territorial officials, and the growing network of telegraph lines that connected distant settlements. The Rocking H Ranch had become a destination for curiosity seekers and journalists who wanted to hear the story firsthand from the participants. Henley found himself reluctantly hosting a steady stream of visitors, all seeking to understand how one man had faced down a supernatural threat that had terrorized an entire territory. The rancher bore these intrusions with characteristic patience. Recognizing that the story had grown beyond his ability to control, Barnes himself had little interest in the attention his actions had generated. The physical wounds from his battle with the creature had healed cleanly, but the psychological impact of the confrontation lingered. He'd looked into the eyes of something that had once been human and chosen savagery over civilization, and that memory haunted his quiet moments. The victory felt less like triumph and more like a necessary duty completed at terrible cost. The surviving wolves had scattered to the far reaches of the territory, their pack structure permanently broken by the loss of their unnatural leader. Ranchers throughout the region reported a return to normal predation patterns, with isolated attacks by small groups rather than the coordinated assaults that had characterized the previous winter. The supernatural threat had been eliminated, but its legacy continued to influence how people understood the relationship between civilization and wilderness. Running Bear visited the ranch regularly throughout the spring, his friendship with Barnes having developed into something approaching brotherhood. The Blackfoot elder brought news from his people's territory and shared observations about the changing patterns of wildlife in the mountains. More importantly, he served as a bridge between two cultures that had found common ground in their shared experience of combat. The tribal council had officially recognized Barnes' role in protecting both white and native lands from the creature's threat. This recognition carried significant weight in territorial politics, as the Blackfoot had become valuable allies in maintaining peace along the frontier. Federal officials in Helena took note of this development, understanding that Barnes' actions had prevented a crisis that could have destabilized the entire region. Young Hutchinson had returned from his winter assignment with stories that added new dimensions to the growing legend. While Barnes had faced the supernatural wolf pack, Hutchinson had spent months riding the southern ranges, dealing with ordinary predators and rustlers. His accounts of how news of the northern battle had reached even the remotest line camps demonstrated the story's rapid spread throughout cowboy culture. Santos brought a different perspective to the evolving narrative. His deep understanding of animal behavior led him to study the remains of the creature and the battlefield site, seeking to understand how such an abomination had come to exist. His conclusions, shared quietly with Barnes and the other senior hands, suggested that extreme isolation and deliberate rejection of human morality had created something that transcended normal categories of man or beast. The cattle that had survived the winter predation were thriving in the spring grass, their numbers slowly recovering from the devastating losses. But more significant was the psychological impact of security restored. Ranchers throughout the territory were expanding their operations into previously abandoned areas, confident that the supernatural threat had been permanently eliminated. Webb had taken on the role of unofficial chronicler, recording the story as it was told by the various participants. His one good hand moved carefully across paper as he interviewed everyone who had played a role in the events. From the cowboys who had prepared Barnes for his mission to the Blackfoot warriors who had participated in the final battle. These written accounts would form the foundation of the legend's official version. The territorial newspaper in Helena published a series of articles about the incident, though the supernatural elements were carefully downplayed in favor of a more conventional narrative about wolf control and frontier courage. The editors understood that their readers preferred heroic stories grounded in recognizable reality, rather than tales that challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world. But the true story, with all its supernatural implications, continued to spread through oral tradition. Cowboys around campfires, trappers in remote cabins, and Native American storytellers all contributed to a growing body of folklore that preserved the essential truth of what had occurred. These versions emphasized the moral choice Barnes had made, the price he had paid, and the victory he had achieved through courage and sacrifice. Summer brought federal investigators to the territory, officials sent by Washington to examine reports of the unusual incident. They interviewed all the principals and examined physical evidence from the battlefield, including the creature's remains and the extensive wolf casualties. Their final report, classified and filed in government archives, acknowledged the supernatural aspects while recommending that public accounts focus on conventional explanations. Barnes found himself uncomfortable with the attention, but recognized his responsibility to preserve the truth for future generations. He cooperated with serious investigators while avoiding sensationalistic journalists who sought to exploit the story for commercial purposes. His goal was ensuring that the lesson of his experience, that evil could take many forms but could be defeated by courage and determination, would survive the inevitable embellishments of legend. The creature's remains had been carefully preserved by Running Bear's people, following traditional practices for dealing with supernatural threats. The Blackfoot understood that such abominations could influence the spiritual balance of the land, if not properly contained. Their rituals ensured that whatever dark forces had corrupted the trapper would not spread to others who might be tempted by similar choices. Henley had quietly dealt with the financial impact of the winter's losses, using insurance settlements and territorial compensation to rebuild the ranch's cattle inventory. More importantly, he had recognized Barnes's unique value and offered him a permanent position as ranch foreman, understanding that the cowboy's experience and reputation would benefit the operation for years to come. The transformation in Barnes's status from drifting hired hand to respected leader represented one of the story's most significant themes. His willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of others had earned him a place in the community that transcended his mysterious past. The ranch hands, who had once viewed him as a competent stranger, now looked to him for leadership and guidance. As autumn approached, Barnes stood on the ridge overlooking the valley where his epic battle had occurred. The grass had grown thick over the blood-stained ground, and wildlife had returned to patterns disrupted by months of supernatural predation. The physical scars of the confrontation were healing, but the memory of what had transpired would endure as long as people told stories of courage under impossible circumstances. Running Bear joined him on the ridge, the two men sharing a moment of quiet reflection about the events that had brought them together. The Blackfoot elder carried a ceremonial pipe, tobacco mixed with herbs that would carry their prayers to the spirits of the place. The ritual acknowledged the spiritual significance of what had occurred, while honoring the sacrifices that had made victory possible. The conversation between the two men touched on themes that would resonate through future tellings of the story. They discussed the nature of choice, the responsibility that came with strength, and the price that must sometimes be paid to protect what mattered most. These philosophical elements would give the legend its enduring power, transforming a simple tale of frontier conflict into a meditation on human nature and moral courage. Word had reached them that similar incidents were being reported in other territories, suggesting that the creature Barnes had faced might not have been unique. Isolated trappers and mountain men, driven to madness by solitude and desperation, were choosing to abandon their humanity in favor of savage existence. The federal government was quietly monitoring these situations, drawing on the lessons learned from the Montana incident. Barnes had begun training selected cowboys and territorial marshals in techniques for recognizing and combating supernatural threats. His experience had taught him that conventional approaches to predator control were inadequate when facing enemies that combined animal ferocity with human intelligence. These teachings would spread throughout the frontier, creating a network of prepared defenders should similar threats emerge. The approaching winter held no fears for the territory's inhabitants. The supernatural pack had been broken, its leader destroyed, and its survivors scattered beyond any possibility of reorganization. Normal life had returned to the valleys and mountain passes, with travelers and settlers able to move freely without fear of coordinated predation. As the first snow began to fall on the high peaks, Barnes reflected on the journey that had brought him from aimless drifter to legendary defender. The transformation had cost him dearly. The scars from his battle would never fully heal, and the memory of facing pure evil would haunt him forever. But he had discovered something more valuable than safety or comfort, a purpose that gave meaning to his existence. The story was already becoming legend, told and retold around fires throughout the territory and beyond. Each telling added new details while preserving the essential truth that one man's willingness to sacrifice everything for others had saved an entire region from supernatural terror. The legend would outlive all its participants, carrying its message of courage and sacrifice to future generations who would face their own impossible choices. Henley had commissioned a local craftsman to create a memorial stone for the battlefield site, marking the place where civilization had made its stand against the forces of savage chaos. The inscription would be simple but powerful, recording the date and the names of those who had participated in the victory. Future travelers would pause at the marker, remembering the price that had been paid for their safety. The Blackfoot had their own plans for preserving the story's memory. Running Bear was working with tribal elders to incorporate the tale into their ceremonial traditions, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of the alliance between native and white defenders. The story would become part of their spiritual heritage, a reminder that evil could be defeated when good people stood together. As winter settled over the Montana Territory, the legend of Fletcher Barnes entered its final phase of transformation from recent history to enduring folklore. The man himself continued his work as ranch foreman, training younger cowboys and preparing for whatever challenges the future might bring. But his actions during that desperate winter had already ensured his immortality in the stories told by those who understood the true meaning of courage. 20 years had passed since the winter that transformed Fletcher Barnes from a drifting cowboy into the stuff of legend. The Montana Territory had achieved statehood. Railroads crossed the plains where cattle drives once moved vast herds, and the frontier was rapidly becoming a memory preserved in the stories of those who had lived it. But in the saloons of mining towns and around campfires on remote ranches, men still spoke of the cowboy who faced down a supernatural wolf pack to protect those who depended on him. Barnes had aged into the role of elder statesman among Montana's ranchers, his hair now silver beneath his worn hat, his face marked by decades of wind and weather. The Rocking H had grown into one of the territory's most successful operations, its reputation built not just on the quality of its cattle, but on the integrity of its leadership. Young cowboys sought positions there, hoping to learn from the man whose name had become synonymous with frontier courage. The physical scars from his battle with the creature had faded to thin white lines across his chest and arms. But Barnes carried other marks that were less visible. He moved with the careful gait of a man whose body had been pushed beyond its limits and survived, and his pale blue eyes held depths that spoke of experiences most men never faced. Yet there was peace in those eyes now, the contentment of someone who had found his purpose and fulfilled it completely. Running Bear had become more than a friend. He was Barnes's closest confidant and advisor. The Blackfoot elder, now in his 70s, visited the ranch regularly, bringing news from the reservation and sharing the wisdom that came from a lifetime of navigating the complex relationship between traditional ways and the modern world. Their conversations often centered on the changes they had witnessed and the lessons their shared experience had taught them about human nature. The legend itself had evolved in ways that both men found fascinating and occasionally disturbing. Traveling storytellers had embellished certain elements while simplifying others, creating versions that served their audience's appetite for supernatural thrills, but sometimes lost the deeper meaning of what had actually occurred. Barnes found himself in the peculiar position of being a living correction to his own legend, able to set the record straight for those genuinely interested in the truth. One such seeker arrived at the ranch on a warm June morning in 1908. Professor Margaret Sullivan from the University of Chicago had traveled west to collect authentic frontier stories for an academic study on American folklore. Unlike the sensation seekers who had pestered Barnes in earlier years, Professor Sullivan brought scholarly credentials and genuine respect for the historical significance of his experience. Barnes found himself surprisingly comfortable talking with the professor, perhaps because her questions focused on the moral dimensions of his choice rather than the sensational aspects of the battle itself. She understood that the true story lay not in the supernatural elements, but in the human decision to stand against overwhelming odds for the sake of others. Their conversations stretched across several days, covering not just the events of that winter, but their lasting impact on his understanding of duty and sacrifice. Professor Sullivan's research revealed how widely the story had spread throughout American culture. Variations of Barnes' tale appeared in dime novels, theatrical productions, and even early moving pictures, though these commercial adaptations bore little resemblance to the actual events. The academic was particularly interested in how different communities had adapted the legend to reflect their own values and concerns. Among Native American tribes throughout the West, the story had become part of a broader tradition of tales about the alliance between indigenous peoples and honorable white men. Running Bear had shared these versions with Barnes, showing how Blackfoot storytellers had woven the tale into their ceremonial cycles, emphasizing the spiritual significance of Barnes' willingness to sacrifice himself for others. In cowboy culture, the legend had evolved into a test of authentic frontier values. Men who claimed to understand the cowboy code were expected to know Barnes' story and draw appropriate lessons from it. The tale served as a reminder that true courage wasn't about seeking glory or proving toughness, but about accepting responsibility for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The Christian communities of the frontier had embraced the story as a parable about sacrificial love, seeing in Barnes' willingness to die for others an echo of deeper theological themes. Rural preachers often used his example in sermons about the cost of discipleship and the call to serve rather than be served. These religious interpretations added another layer to the legend's cultural significance. European visitors to the American West frequently sought out Barnes and other legendary figures, fascinated by what they saw as uniquely American virtues. A German anthropologist spent weeks at the ranch, documenting not just the story itself, but the cultural context that had produced such a tale. His research contributed to growing European understanding of American frontier values and their influence on the national character. The changing technology of the early 20th century brought new challenges to preserving the authentic story. Motion picture producers approached Barnes with offers to adapt his experience for the screen, promising fame and financial reward in exchange for the rights to his story. He declined these offers, understanding that commercial entertainment would inevitably distort the truth in favor of dramatic effect. However, Barnes did cooperate with efforts to create accurate historical records. The Montana Historical Society had begun collecting oral histories from surviving frontier figures, recognizing that an entire era of American experience would soon be lost forever. Barnes contributed detailed accounts, not just of his own experience, but of the broader context of frontier life in the 1880s. These interviews revealed aspects of the story that had been overshadowed by its supernatural elements. Barnes spoke about the economic pressures facing ranchers, the complex relationships between white settlers and Native American tribes, and the psychological challenges of frontier isolation. These contextual details helped historians understand how individual acts of heroism fit into the broader patterns of American expansion. The railroad had finally reached the remote valley where Barnes had fought his legendary battle, bringing tourists who wanted to see the site where the confrontation had occurred. A small monument had been erected near the location of the old line camp, funded by contributions from cowboys, ranchers, and Blackfoot tribal members who wanted to preserve the memory of what had happened there. Barnes occasionally guided visitors to the site, though he found these pilgrimages emotionally difficult. The valley had returned to its natural state, showing no signs of the desperate battle that had raged across its snow-covered floor. Only the monument and the stories carried by visitors testified to the events that had transformed an obscure cowboy into a legend. Young people especially sought him out, looking for guidance about how to find meaning and purpose in their own lives. Barnes discovered that his experience resonated with each new generation, though the specific challenges they faced were different from those of the frontier era. The essential questions remained the same. What was worth sacrificing for? How should someone respond when faced with impossible odds? What did it mean to live with integrity? His advice to these seekers was characteristically practical. He emphasized the importance of keeping one's word, treating others with respect regardless of their background, and accepting responsibility rather than seeking to avoid it. These simple principles, lived out consistently over decades, had earned him the respect of everyone who knew him personally. The success of the Rocking H had provided Barnes with financial security, but he lived modestly, more comfortable in work clothes than formal attire. His personal quarters remained Spartan, furnished with items chosen for utility rather than display. The only decoration of note was a beaded medicine bag given to him by Running Bear, a token of their friendship and shared experience. Henley had passed away several years earlier, leaving the ranch to Barnes in recognition of his decades of loyal service. The transition had been smooth, as Barnes had effectively been running the operation for years, while Henley focused on territorial politics and business investments. Under Barnes's leadership, the ranch had maintained its reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock. The cowboys who worked for Barnes found him demanding but fair, a boss who expected hard work but was willing to do his share of the difficult and dangerous tasks. His management style reflected lessons learned during his legendary winter, particularly the importance of shared sacrifice and mutual support. The ranch's success was built on these principles, creating a workplace culture that attracted the best hands in the territory. As Montana entered the modern era, Barnes found himself serving as a bridge between the frontier past and the industrial future. He adapted ranching techniques to incorporate new technologies while preserving the traditional values that had made frontier communities successful. Young ranchers sought his advice on navigating the changing economic landscape while maintaining their connection to the land. The federal government occasionally consulted him on matters related to wildlife management and frontier security. His experience with supernatural threats had given him insights into predator behavior that proved valuable in dealing with more conventional problems. He served on territorial commissions and advised army units responsible for maintaining peace along the Canadian border. But perhaps his most important role was as keeper of the authentic story, ensuring that future generations would understand what had really happened during that desperate winter. As the frontier era faded into history, Barnes recognized that the legend would outlive all its participants, carrying forward whatever lessons people chose to find in it. He had begun working on written memoirs, not for publication, but as a record for his heirs and the historical societies that would preserve frontier history. The writing process forced him to examine his motivations and choices with the perspective that only decades of reflection could provide. He wanted future readers to understand not just what he had done, but why he had chosen to act as he did. The memoir project also led him to correspond with other legendary figures from the frontier era, comparing experiences and perspectives on the dramatic changes they had witnessed. These exchanges revealed common themes in the stories of men and women who had faced extraordinary challenges and emerged as symbols of American courage and determination. As autumn painted the Montana mountains in brilliant colors, Barnes stood once again on the ridge overlooking the valley where his legend had been born. The landscape remained essentially unchanged, but everything else had been transformed by the passage of time and the march of civilization. He had lived to see his story become part of American folklore, ensuring that the values he had exemplified would influence future generations. Long after the frontier itself was only a memory, the year 1912 brought unexpected challenges that would test the lessons Fletcher Barnes had learned during his legendary confrontation with evil. A series of brutal murders across 3 counties had baffled local law enforcement and territorial authorities, creating a climate of fear that reminded old-timers of the supernatural terror that had once gripped the region. The killer seemed to possess knowledge of wilderness survival and tracking that exceeded normal criminal capabilities, leading some to whisper that the creature Barnes had defeated had somehow returned. Sheriff Daniel Cormack of Millbrook County arrived at the Rocking H on a grey October morning, his weathered face bearing the strain of a man dealing with crimes beyond his experience. Cormack had served as a deputy during the Wolf Crisis 25 years earlier and understood better than most the nature of the threats that could emerge from Montana's vast wilderness. He sought Barnes not just as a consultant, but as the only man alive who had faced something similar and survived. The evidence Cormack presented painted a disturbing picture. 7 victims had been found over the past 2 months, all discovered in remote locations, with wounds that suggested animal attack, but circumstances that pointed to human intelligence. The killer chose isolated targets, trappers, prospectors, and travelers who wouldn't be missed immediately. More troubling was the pattern of escalation, with each attack showing increasing savagery and apparent confidence. Barnes studied the sheriff's photographs and reports with the methodical attention he'd once applied to tracking wolf signs through fresh snow. The wounds were consistent with large claws, but their placement suggested someone who understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum suffering before death. Most disturbing were the signs that victims had been kept alive for extended periods, as if the killer derived pleasure from prolonging their terror. What convinced Barnes that they were dealing with something beyond ordinary criminality were the ritualistic elements present at each scene. Personal belongings had been arranged in patterns that echoed the bone displays Running Bear had described at the original creature's lair. The killer wasn't just murdering randomly. He was following some twisted, ceremonial purpose that suggested a connection to the supernatural events of 1887 running. Bear confirmed Barnes's suspicions. When he arrived at the ranch 3 days later, his aged face grave with knowledge he wished he didn't possess. The Blackfoot elder had been conducting his own investigation among tribal members who still remembered the old threats and their warning signs. What he had discovered suggested that the evil Barnes had thought permanently destroyed had found a new vessel through which to continue its work. According to tribal sources, a young white man had appeared at various reservations over the past year, claiming to be an anthropologist studying Native American spiritual practices. He'd shown particular interest in stories about shape-shifting and the transformation of humans into predatory animals. Several tribal elders had refused to speak with him, sensing something unwholesome in his intensity and the questions he asked. The man had been especially persistent in seeking information about the creature Barnes had killed, offering money for details about its abilities and the methods it had used to control the wolf pack. When respectable sources refused his requests, he'd sought out troubled individuals willing to share dangerous knowledge in exchange for alcohol or coins. Through these questionable contacts, he'd apparently pieced together enough information to begin his own transformation. Barnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather as he listened to Running Bear's account. The creature he'd fought had been driven to its monstrous state by isolation and desperation, but this new threat was deliberately choosing evil, actively seeking the power that came from abandoning humanity. The implications were terrifying. If the knowledge of transformation could be passed from one person to another, the victory won at such great cost 25 years earlier had been merely temporary. The investigation led Barnes and Sheriff Cormack to the abandoned mining camp of Copper Falls, where witnesses reported seeing the suspicious anthropologist several months earlier. The camp had been played out for a decade, its buildings left to the weather and scavengers. But recent disturbance of the area suggested someone had been using the location as a base of operations. What they found in the main mine shaft exceeded their worst fears. The anthropologist had created a shrine to the creature Barnes had killed, using bones from his victims to reconstruct the ritualistic displays that had marked the original monster's lair. Crude drawings on the cave walls depicted the transformation process in graphic detail, showing how human consciousness could be gradually surrendered to animal instinct. Most horrifying was evidence that the transformation was already well advanced. Claw marks on the cave walls were too large for human hands, and tufts of coarse hair suggested physical changes that matched those Barnes remembered from his original opponent. The anthropologist was following the same path as the trapper who had become the pack leader, but with the advantage of deliberate preparation rather than accidental corruption. Barnes understood that conventional law enforcement would be inadequate against this new threat. Sheriff Cormack was a brave and competent man, but he lacked the experience necessary to face something that existed beyond normal categories of criminal behavior. The creature they were tracking possessed human intelligence, combined with superhuman physical capabilities, and complete freedom from moral restraint. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, Miguel's daughter, who now worked as a schoolteacher in Millbrook, reported that one of her students had been approached by a strange man asking questions about her father's stories of the old wolf attacks. The child had been frightened by the man's intensity and the predatory way he watched her during their conversation. This contact pattern suggested the creature was preparing for another major escalation, possibly planning to target people connected to the original events. Barnes realized that everyone who had played a role in the 1887 confrontation could be at risk, including himself and the surviving Blackfoot warriors who had participated in the final battle. The decision to take proactive action came when tracks were found less than 5 miles from the ranch headquarters. The prints were clearly human, but showed the elongated toes and extended gait that marked the early stages of the transformation process. The creature was scouting the rocking H, preparing for an attack that would represent more than simple revenge. It would be a symbolic assertion of dominance. over the forces that had defeated its predecessor. Barnes spent a sleepless night preparing for what might be his final confrontation with supernatural evil. His body was 25 years older, his reflexes not as sharp as they had been during that legendary winter. But his understanding of such creatures had deepened through decades of reflection, and he possessed something his younger self had lacked: complete certainty about what he was fighting for and why the battle was necessary. Running Bear arrived at dawn with 4 young Blackfoot warriors, men he had trained in the traditional methods for dealing with supernatural threats. Unlike the emergency response of 1887, this would be a planned campaign designed to track and eliminate the creature before it could complete its transformation or claim additional victims. The hunt began at first light, with the team following tracks that led deeper into the wilderness areas where normal law enforcement couldn't operate effectively. The creature was clever, using terrain and weather to obscure its trail, but it couldn't completely hide the signs of its unnatural presence. Disturbed wildlife patterns and the lingering scent of corruption marked its passage through the forest. By afternoon, they had tracked their quarry to a box canyon that offered limited escape routes. The creature had chosen its refuge well, creating a lair in caves that provided multiple defensive positions while limiting the approaches available to attackers. Barnes recognized the tactical intelligence behind the choice. This wasn't the desperate flight of a cornered animal, but the strategic withdrawal of a thinking opponent. The confrontation began as shadows lengthened across the canyon floor. The creature emerged from its cave partially transformed, standing upright but moving with the fluid grace of something that was no longer entirely human. It retained enough human features to be recognizable as the anthropologist witnesses had described, but its eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator that viewed other humans as prey rather than fellow beings. Unlike the desperate battle of 1887, this fight was conducted with careful preparation and coordinated tactics. Barnes and his allies had studied the creature's capabilities and weaknesses, developing strategies based on hard-won knowledge of supernatural combat. The Blackfoot warriors used traditional weapons, blessed by tribal shamans, while Barnes carried the same Winchester that had served him in his legendary battle. The creature fought with the cunning of human intelligence combined with superhuman strength and speed. It used the canyon's geography to its advantage, forcing its opponents to attack uphill, while remaining mobile enough to strike from unexpected angles. But it faced adversaries who understood its nature and had prepared specifically for this type of confrontation. The battle raged through the afternoon and into the evening, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The creature's transformation gave it physical capabilities that exceeded normal human limits, but Barnes's experience and the warrior's spiritual preparation provided crucial advantages. Most importantly, they were fighting for the protection of innocent lives, while their opponent was driven only by hunger for power and dominance. As darkness fell, Barnes found himself once again facing a creature that represented the darkest possibilities of human choice. But this time he wasn't alone, and he wasn't fighting merely to survive. He was part of a coordinated effort to eliminate a threat before it could fully mature. The lessons learned from his first encounter had been passed on to others, creating a legacy of preparedness that transcended individual heroism. The creature's end came when it overextended itself in a desperate attack, leaving itself vulnerable to the coordinated response Barnes and the warriors had practiced. Multiple weapons struck simultaneously, delivering the kind of overwhelming damage necessary to stop something that possessed superhuman resilience. The anthropologist's transformation was permanently halted, his corrupted form reverting partially to human appearance in death. As the canyon fell silent, except for the sounds of wind and distant wildlife, Barnes felt a profound sense of completion. The victory represented more than the elimination of another supernatural threat. It demonstrated that the knowledge and values he had fought to preserve could be successfully transmitted to others. The evil he had first confronted alone could now be faced by a prepared community of defenders. The aftermath revealed the full extent of the creature's planned campaign of terror. Evidence in its lair showed detailed surveillance of potential victims throughout the territory, including families with children and elderly individuals who would have been defenseless against supernatural attack. By acting proactively, Barnes and his allies had prevented a massacre that would have rivaled the original Wolf crisis. Sheriff Cormac's official report carefully omitted the supernatural elements of the case, describing it instead as the elimination of a dangerous criminal who had been using trained animals to commit murders. This version satisfied legal requirements, while protecting the public from knowledge that might inspire other, troubled individuals to attempt similar transformations. But among those who understood the truth, Barnes's second victory added new dimensions to his legend. He had proven that the courage and sacrifice of one man could create lasting change, establishing traditions and knowledge that would protect future generations. The story would continue to evolve, but its essential message remained clear. Evil could be defeated when good people were willing to pay the necessary price. The Great War had ended across the Atlantic, but its echoes reached even the remote valleys of Montana, where Fletcher Barnes had built his legend. Young men from the territory had marched off to fight in foreign trenches, carrying with them stories their grandfathers had told about courage under impossible odds. Some returned speaking of horrors that made frontier dangers seem manageable by comparison, while others never came home at all. The world was changing in ways that made the old certainties seem fragile and precious. Barnes, now in his 64th year, found himself serving as more than just a rancher and keeper of frontier memories. Veterans of the European conflict sought him out, drawn by stories of his legendary battles against supernatural evil. These young men had faced machine guns and poison gas, witnessed industrialized slaughter on a scale that dwarfed anything the frontier had known. Yet they recognized in Barnes's story something they desperately needed, proof that individual courage could still matter in a world that seemed to have lost its way. The influenza pandemic of 1918 struck Montana with devastating force, killing more people in 6 months than all the Indian wars and frontier violence combined. Barnes watched helplessly as neighbors and friends succumbed to an enemy that couldn't be fought with rifles or determination. The randomness of the disease's toll reminded him of lessons learned decades earlier, that some battles required different kinds of courage, and that victory sometimes meant accepting loss while protecting what could still be saved. During the worst months of the pandemic, Barnes opened the Rocking H to serve as an unofficial hospital for isolated families who couldn't reach proper medical care. His experience with frontier medicine, learned during years when the nearest doctor might be days away, proved valuable in caring for the sick. More importantly, his presence provided comfort to those facing death, a reminder that courage in the face of inevitable loss was its own form of victory. Running Bear had passed away the previous winter, succumbing to the accumulated weight of his years during a particularly harsh cold snap. His death marked the end of an era for Barnes, severing his last direct connection to the supernatural battles that had defined his legend. But the Blackfoot elder had spent his final years ensuring that the knowledge and traditions necessary to face such threats would survive him, training younger tribal members in the ancient ways of recognizing and combating evil. The funeral ceremony for Running Bear brought together an unprecedented gathering of whites and Native Americans, united in their respect for a man who had bridged 2 worlds. Barnes spoke at the service, describing their friendship and the battles they had shared with an eloquence that surprised those who knew him only as a taciturn rancher. His words revealed the depth of understanding that had developed between 2 men who had faced ultimate darkness together and emerged with their humanity intact. With Running Bear's death, Barnes became the sole surviving participant in the original supernatural confrontation of 1887. This unique status brought new responsibilities as historians. Writers and government officials sought authoritative accounts of events that were rapidly passing from living memory into legend. He found himself serving as the final arbiter of what had actually happened during those desperate winter months when evil had threatened to consume the entire territory. The memoir project he had begun years earlier became increasingly urgent as Barnes recognized his own mortality. The written account would serve as more than just a historical record. It would preserve the tactical knowledge and spiritual insights necessary for future defenders to face similar threats. He worked methodically through long winter evenings, crafting prose that captured not just the events, but the reasoning behind crucial decisions. New challenges emerged as the 1920s brought rapid modernization to Montana. Prohibition created opportunities for criminals who used the state's remote valleys and mountain passes for smuggling operations. Some of these illegal enterprises attracted individuals whose moral corruption reminded Barnes of the creatures he had fought. While these weren't supernatural threats, they represented the same fundamental choice between civilization and savagery that had defined his legendary battles. Barnes found himself consulted by federal agents who were trying to combat organized crime in the region. His knowledge of wilderness survival and tracking proved valuable, but more important was his ability to recognize the psychological patterns that distinguished ordinary criminals from those who had chosen to embrace evil completely. These consultations led to several successful operations that disrupted major smuggling networks. The success of these law enforcement collaborations established Barnes as an unofficial expert on criminal psychology and wilderness tactics. Government agencies began sending promising agents to train with him, learning skills that couldn't be taught in formal academies. The Rocking H became a secret training ground where federal officers learned to think like both hunters and prey, preparing for confrontations in environments where conventional law enforcement techniques were inadequate. Among Barnes's most dedicated students was Agent Catherine Walsh of the Bureau of Investigation, one of the first women to be assigned to dangerous fieldwork in the Western Territories. Walsh had studied Barnes's written accounts of his supernatural encounters and recognized their applicability to more conventional criminal cases. Under his tutelage, she developed techniques for tracking dangerous fugitives through wilderness areas while maintaining the psychological strength necessary to face opponents who had abandoned all moral constraints. The training programs Barnes conducted emphasized psychological preparation as much as tactical skills. He had learned through bitter experience that facing true evil required more than physical courage. It demanded absolute clarity about what was worth protecting and why the fight was necessary. Students who lacked this moral foundation inevitably failed when tested against opponents who fought without any ethical limitations. News of Barnes's involvement in federal law enforcement eventually reached Hollywood producers who were beginning to create Western films with more sophisticated storylines. They approached him with offers to serve as technical consultant on movies that would bring frontier stories to national audiences. Unlike earlier approaches that had focused on sensationalizing his supernatural encounters, these offers recognized his expertise in authentic frontier skills and values. Barnes agreed to work on selected projects that met his standards for historical accuracy and moral integrity. He insisted on scripts that emphasized the ethical dimensions of frontier conflicts rather than simple violence and adventure. The films he consulted on became models for a more mature approach to Western storytelling, influencing how subsequent generations would understand the values that had built American civilization. His involvement in film production brought Barnes into contact with other legendary figures from the frontier era who were still alive in the 1920s. These meetings revealed common themes in their experiences: the importance of keeping one's word, the necessity of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves, and the recognition that true strength came from serving something larger than oneself. Their conversations provided material for Barnes' memoir while reinforcing his understanding of the frontier's lasting contributions to American character. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression tested the economic foundations that Barnes had spent decades building. The Rocking H survived because of the diversified income sources he had developed and the reputation for reliability that attracted customers even during hard times. More importantly, the ranch continued to serve as a refuge for people facing desperate circumstances, maintaining the tradition of hospitality that frontier communities had relied upon for survival. During the worst years of the Depression, Barnes employed more cowboys than economic conditions justified, understanding that maintaining hope and dignity was more important than short-term profits. Many of the men who worked for him during this period would later credit the experience with saving their lives, providing not just employment, but exposure to values that helped them navigate the crisis. With their integrity intact, the approach of World War II brought new requests for Barnes' expertise as the government prepared for potential threats to domestic security. Intelligence agencies were concerned about the possibility of enemy agents operating in remote areas where conventional surveillance would be difficult. Barnes' knowledge of wilderness survival and his experience in training federal agents made him a valuable consultant in developing countermeasures. He also found himself advising military units on unconventional warfare techniques, sharing knowledge gained from decades of facing opponents who didn't follow normal rules of engagement. While the specific threats were different from those he had confronted in his youth, the fundamental principles remained the same. Success required superior preparation, absolute commitment, and unwavering clarity about what was being defended. As Barnes entered his 70s, he began to experience the physical limitations that came with age and a lifetime of demanding work. The scars from his legendary battles ached during cold weather, and his reflexes were no longer adequate for the kind of field work that had once defined his capabilities. But his mind remained sharp, and his understanding of human nature had deepened with experience. The completion of his memoir in 1941 marked the culmination of decades of reflection on the choices that had shaped his life and legend. The final manuscript ran to over 300 pages, combining detailed accounts of his supernatural encounters with broader observations about frontier life and the values that had made American expansion possible. He arranged for copies to be deposited with the Montana Historical Society, the Smithsonian Institution, and selected federal agencies that might need the information in future. Crises. Barnes's final public appearance came at the dedication of a memorial to Montana veterans of both World Wars. Speaking to a crowd that included many former students and colleagues, he reflected on the continuity of values that connected frontier defenders to modern soldiers. The same willingness to sacrifice for others, the same commitment to protecting the innocent, and the same recognition that some things were worth dying for. These principles transcended the specific challenges of any particular era. He passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold January night in 1942, found the next morning in his chair by the window that looked out toward the valley where his legend had been born. The Rocking H continued to operate under the management team he had trained, but the loss of its legendary owner marked the end of a direct connection to the frontier era that had shaped American character. The funeral drew thousands of mourners from across the West, including federal agents, tribal leaders, former cowboys, and veterans who had learned from his example. The ceremony combined Christian prayers with Blackfoot spiritual traditions, honoring both his personal faith and his respect for Native American wisdom. Running Bear's grandson spoke for the tribe, describing Barnes as a warrior whose battles had protected all people, regardless of their background. In the decades that followed, Barnes' legend continued to evolve as each generation found new meanings in his story. The memoir became required reading for federal agents working in remote areas, while the tactical knowledge it contained influenced military doctrine for unconventional warfare. More importantly, the moral example it provided inspired countless individuals to choose courage over safety when faced with their own impossible odds. The supernatural threats that Barnes had fought never returned to Montana, suggesting that his victories had been more complete than even he had understood. The knowledge and traditions he had established created a network of prepared defenders who could recognize and respond to such dangers before they could fully develop. His legacy lived on, not just in stories told around campfires, but in the practical wisdom passed down through generations of people committed to protecting what mattered most. Today, visitors to the Montana mountains can still find the monuments that mark the sites of Barnes's legendary battles. The inscriptions have weathered with time, but the essential message remains clear, that one man's willingness to sacrifice everything for others had saved an entire region from supernatural terror. The legend continues to inspire those who face their own impossible choices, reminding them that courage and determination can overcome any evil. No matter how powerful or terrifying it might seem, the investigation into Barnes's personal effects after his death revealed the true scope of his influence on American frontier culture. Hidden compartments in his desk contained correspondence with legendary figures across the West, lawmen like Wyatt Earp, soldiers like George Crook, and even outlaws who had sought his advice on abandoning their criminal ways. These letters showed Barnes as a moral compass for an entire generation of frontier figures, sought out for counsel by men who faced their own defining moments. Among the most significant discoveries was a detailed map Barnes had created, marking locations throughout the American West where similar supernatural encounters had been reported or suspected. His network of correspondence had provided information about mysterious deaths, unexplained animal behavior, and isolated individuals who showed signs of the same corruption that had afflicted the creatures he fought. The map suggested a pattern of such threats that extended far beyond Montana's borders. This cartographic evidence prompted a secret federal investigation that continued well into the 1950s. Government agents trained using Barnes' methods quietly investigated the marked locations and found evidence supporting his assessments. Several sites showed clear signs of supernatural activity, while others revealed the remains of creatures similar to those Barnes had defeated. The investigation validated his belief that the evil he had confronted represented part of a larger phenomenon that required constant vigilance. The Cold War era brought new relevance to Barnes's tactical innovations as intelligence. Agencies faced opponents who operated outside conventional frameworks. Soviet agents and communist sympathizers sometimes displayed the same moral flexibility that characterized the supernatural threats Barnes had fought, making his psychological insights valuable for counterintelligence operations. Training programs based on his writings became the standard curriculum for agents working in hostile territories. When normal support systems were unavailable, academic interest in Barnes' story intensified during the 1960s as scholars began serious study of American folklore and its relationship to national identity. Anthropologists found that variations of his tale had spread throughout Native American communities across the continent, adapted to local traditions but preserving the essential theme of sacrificial courage. These studies revealed how stories of moral heroism could transcend cultural boundaries to become universal expressions of human potential. The environmental movement of the 70s embraced Barnes as an early example of sustainable land use and respectful coexistence with wildlife. His ranch management practices, documented in correspondence and government reports, showed sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships decades before such concepts became mainstream. Environmental activists cited his example when arguing for balanced approaches to development that honored both human needs and natural systems. Television documentaries in the 1980s brought Barnes's story to national audiences for the first time since the silent film era. Unlike earlier commercial adaptations, these programs emphasized historical accuracy and featured interviews with descendants of people who had known Barnes personally. The documentaries revealed how his influence had shaped entire communities throughout the Mountain West, creating networks of families committed to the values he had exemplified. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 prompted a re-evaluation of Barnes's strategic insights as intelligence agencies adapted to new threats from non-state actors and international criminals. His understanding of opponents who rejected all moral constraints proved particularly relevant as terrorism became a primary security concern. Special forces units studied his wilderness tactics and psychological preparation methods, finding applications in modern unconventional warfare. Archaeological excavations at the sites of Barnes' battles during the 1990s provided physical evidence supporting the supernatural elements of his story. Researchers found bone fragments from wolves significantly larger than any known species, along with human remains showing anatomical modifications that defied medical explanation. These discoveries, classified by federal authorities but leaked to academic journals, generated intense debate about the true nature of what Barnes had confronted. The digital age brought new challenges as online communities began sharing dangerous information about supernatural transformation and occult practices. Federal agencies, still using protocols derived from Barnes's writings, monitored these networks for signs that individuals might be attempting to replicate the evil he had defeated. Several cases were identified and quietly resolved before they could develop into major threats, validating the continued relevance of his defensive strategies. Modern ranchers throughout the West continued to benefit from agricultural techniques Barnes had developed during his decades, managing the rocking age. His methods for sustainable grazing, water conservation, and predator management influenced industry practices well into the 21st century. Agricultural colleges taught case studies based on his operations, emphasizing how traditional wisdom could be combined with scientific innovation to achieve long-term success. The events of September 11, 2001, prompted new interest in Barnes' writings about facing enemies who operated outside civilized norms. His insights into the psychology of those who chose absolute evil over moral compromise provided frameworks for understanding terrorist motivations and developing effective countermeasures. Military academies incorporated his work into curricula, dealing with asymmetric warfare and the mental preparation necessary for extended conflicts against unconventional opponents. International scholars began studying Barnes' story as an example of how democratic societies could produce individuals capable of extraordinary sacrifice for communal benefit. Comparative mythology researchers found parallels between his tale and heroic stories from cultures worldwide, suggesting universal human recognition of the values he had embodied. These studies contributed to growing understanding of how shared narratives could unite diverse populations around common ideals. The establishment of the Fletcher Barnes Memorial Foundation in 2005 provided institutional support for preserving his legacy and continuing his work. The foundation maintained the original Rocking H Ranch as a historical site and training center, offering programs in wilderness survival, crisis leadership, and moral decision-making under extreme stress. Participants included military personnel, law enforcement officers, emergency responders, and business leaders who needed to prepare for situations where conventional approaches would be inadequate. Climate change research in the 21st century validated many of Barnes' observations about long-term environmental patterns and their effects on wildlife behavior. His detailed records of seasonal variations, animal migration routes, and weather patterns provided baseline data for scientists studying ecological changes over century-long timescales. Environmental historians credited him as an early practitioner of citizen science who had understood the importance of systematic observation and documentation. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brought renewed attention to Barnes's example of community service. During the 1918 influenza crisis, public health officials studied his methods for organizing care networks in isolated areas, finding principles that remained applicable to modern emergency response. His emphasis on maintaining hope and dignity during catastrophic events provided psychological guidance for communities. Facing extended periods of crisis and uncertainty, the establishment of national parks throughout the American West during the early 20th century drew heavily on Barnes's philosophy of balancing human access with wilderness preservation. Park Service administrators studied his ranch management records to understand how sustainable tourism could be developed without destroying the natural systems that made these areas valuable. His approach to controlled access and visitor education became foundational principles for the modern park system. Space program administrators in the 1960s found unexpected applications for Barnes's isolation survival techniques as they prepared astronauts for extended missions. His writings about maintaining psychological stability during months of solitary confinement proved remarkably applicable to space travel conditions. NASA psychologists adapted his mental preparation exercises for use in astronaut training, recognizing that the frontier skills he had mastered translated directly to humanity's newest frontier. The rise of extreme sports and adventure tourism in the late 20th century created new demand for Barnes's wilderness expertise. Professional guides and expedition leaders studied his methods for risk assessment and crisis management in remote environments. Mountain climbing organizations, whitewater rafting companies, and wilderness therapy programs incorporated his safety protocols into their standard operating procedures, potentially saving hundreds of lives over subsequent decades. Corporate leadership development programs beginning in the 1980s discovered that Barnes's decision-making frameworks were highly effective for business executives facing ethical dilemmas under extreme pressure. Management consultants adapted his teachings about maintaining moral clarity when confronted by opponents who operated without ethical constraints. Fortune 500 companies sent their executives to leadership retreats at the preserved Rocking H Ranch, where they studied Barnes's example while learning to make difficult decisions that balanced competing interests. The emergence of cybersecurity as a critical national concern in the 1990s revealed surprising parallels between Barnes' battles against supernatural evil and modern conflicts in digital space. Computer security experts found that his insights into opponents who could change their nature and operate outside normal rules applied directly to sophisticated hackers and state-sponsored cyber warriors. Training programs for cybersecurity. Professionals incorporated his psychological preparation methods alongside technical instruction. International peacekeeping operations in the post-Cold War era benefited from Barnes's understanding of how to maintain moral authority while operating in environments where traditional rules didn't apply. United Nations peacekeepers studied his methods for distinguishing between legitimate authority and predatory power, learning to recognize when compromise became collaboration with evil. His example influenced rules of engagement that balanced humanitarian concerns with the necessity of decisive action against truly dangerous opponents. The growing awareness of human trafficking as a global crisis brought new relevance to Barnes's insights about recognizing and confronting those who had chosen to exploit the vulnerable. Federal agents working anti-trafficking cases found that his psychological profiles of supernatural predators matched disturbing patterns in human trafficking organizations. Task force commanders used his tactical approaches when planning operations against criminal networks that operated beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Educational reformers in the early 21st century embraced Barnes's story as an example of character development that transcended formal schooling. His transformation from directionless drifter to legendary protector demonstrated how individuals could discover their true purpose through accepting responsibility for others' welfare. Schools throughout the Mountain West incorporated his biography into curricula designed to teach students about moral courage and civic responsibility. The rise of social media platforms created new opportunities for spreading dangerous ideologies, prompting federal agencies to develop monitoring systems based on Barnes's methods for recognizing early signs of moral corruption. Intelligence analysts studied his descriptions of how individuals gradually abandoned their humanity, using these insights to identify online communities where similar transformation processes might be occurring. Several intervention programs were developed to reach troubled individuals before they could progress too far down paths toward violence. Climate refugees and environmental displacement in the 21st century created situations that echoed the frontier conditions Barnes had navigated. Relief organizations working with displaced populations found that his community-building techniques were highly effective for maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress. His methods for organizing mutual aid networks and maintaining hope during extended crises provided templates for humanitarian operations worldwide. The development of artificial intelligence raised philosophical questions that Barnes's writings had anticipated in discussing the nature of consciousness and moral choice. Computer scientists and ethicists studying the implications of AI found that his insights into what distinguished human intelligence from other forms of cognition remained relevant to modern debates. His emphasis on the crucial role of moral purpose in defining authentic humanity influenced discussions about how to develop AI systems that would serve rather than replace human judgment. Disaster preparedness specialists in the federal government created training scenarios based on Barnes's experiences with cascading crises that overwhelmed normal response capabilities. His methods for maintaining command structure and resource allocation during supernatural emergencies proved applicable to natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and pandemic responses. Emergency management agencies throughout the country adopted protocols derived from his crisis leadership examples. The study of extremist movements and domestic terrorism in the 21st century revealed disturbing parallels to the supernatural threats Barnes had confronted. Researchers found that the psychological processes by which individuals abandoned civilized behavior to join violent movements closely matched his descriptions of supernatural transformation. Counter-terrorism specialists used his analytical frameworks to develop intervention strategies for preventing radicalization before it reached violent stages. Archaeological teams working at ancient sites throughout the Americas discovered evidence suggesting that supernatural threats similar to those Barnes fought had appeared periodically throughout human history. These findings, combined with Native American oral traditions that predated European contact, indicated that his battles were part of a much longer struggle between forces of civilization and primordial chaos. Anthropologists began to understand his story as the most recent chapter in an ongoing conflict that stretched back thousands of years. The emergence of private military contractors and security companies in modern conflicts created new applications for Barnes' teachings about maintaining ethical standards while operating in morally ambiguous environments. Professional soldiers and security specialists studied his methods for preserving their humanity while fighting opponents who had abandoned all moral constraints. His example provided crucial guidance for maintaining military professionalism in situations where traditional command structures were absent or compromised. Behavioral economists studying decision-making under extreme uncertainty found that Barnes's choices during his legendary confrontations illustrated principles that remained applicable to modern risk management. Business schools began teaching case studies based on his decisions, using them to demonstrate how individuals could maintain rational judgment even when facing seemingly impossible odds. His example became a standard reference point for discussions about leadership during crisis situations. The opioid epidemic and related addiction crises of the early 21st century prompted new interest in Barnes's insights about individuals who chose self-destruction over accepting help from their communities. Addiction counselors and social workers found that his understanding of the psychology behind choosing immediate gratification over long-term welfare provided valuable frameworks for intervention strategies. Treatment programs incorporated his emphasis on the importance of purpose and responsibility in overcoming destructive patterns. International development organizations working in failed states and conflict zones discovered that Barnes's methods for building trust across cultural boundaries were highly effective in post-conflict reconstruction efforts. His example of cooperation with Running Bear and the Blackfoot community provided models for how outsiders could work respectfully with indigenous populations while addressing shared security threats. Development specialists used his approaches when designing programs that required collaboration between previously hostile communities. The growing recognition of mental health challenges among military veterans prompted new applications of Barnes' insights about psychological recovery from traumatic encounters with evil. Veterans organizations found that his writings about processing the moral dimensions of violence provided valuable resources for soldiers struggling to reintegrate into civilian society. His example demonstrated how individuals who had faced extreme darkness could find meaning and purpose through service to others rather than isolation and withdrawal. Cyberbullying and online harassment campaigns in the digital age exhibited patterns that echoed the psychological warfare tactics Barnes had faced from supernatural opponents. Digital safety advocates studied his methods for maintaining psychological resilience when confronted by adversaries who sought to break down their victims' sense of self-worth and moral clarity. Educational programs for young people incorporated his teachings about recognizing and responding to predatory behavior in online environments. The emergence of conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns as tools of political manipulation revealed new applications for Barnes's insights about distinguishing truth from deliberate deception. Media literacy educators found that his methods for evaluating information sources and maintaining critical thinking under psychological pressure were highly relevant to modern information warfare. His example provided frameworks for helping citizens navigate complex information environments while preserving their ability to make informed decisions. Fletcher Barnes had lived long enough to see his story become part of American mythology, joining the ranks of legendary figures who embodied the nation's highest ideals. But more than fame or recognition, he had achieved something rarer: the satisfaction of knowing that his sacrifices had made a lasting difference, protecting countless innocent lives and preserving values that would guide future generations through whatever darkness they might face. His legacy endured not merely as entertainment or inspiration, but as practical wisdom that continued protecting people from threats both seen and unseen, ensuring that the choice between civilization and savagery would always have defenders willing to pay the ultimate price. The cowboy who had once drifted aimlessly through the Montana Territory had become something far greater than he could have imagined: a permanent guardian whose influence would protect the innocent for as long as stories were told. And moral courage was needed to stand against the darkness that perpetually threatened to consume the light of human civilization. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.